Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, 2025 Threat Landscape Trends to Watch. My name is Melissa Russell, and I'll be the host for today's session. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over a few housekeeping items. We are recording this session, and we will make a link to the recording as well as a link to the slides available. I will probably be sending that in the next day or so afterwards, so check your email for those. If you do have any questions during the session, please go ahead and throw them into the Q&A chat, and we'll try and save a little bit of time at the end to address some of the questions. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers. I am joined today by Paul Azadorian, who is our principal security researcher here at Eclypsium. And he is also joined by Chase Snyder, our director of product marketing, who will be guiding us through this discussion. At this time, gentlemen, the floor is all yours.
Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks so much, Melissa. Paul, awesome to be here with you, security researcher and podcaster extraordinaire. And yeah, 2025 threat landscape, trends to watch. A lot of stuff happened in 2024 that we think is going to continue to build momentum in 2025. So we'll recap a couple of the things that happened late last year and talk about what is coming down the pike and what you need to watch out for to secure your enterprise environments this year. So on the agenda, we have the star, I'm calling it Wildcard Typhoon, Salt Typhoon, Volt Typhoon, Flax Typhoon. You get a typhoon, you get a typhoon. There's no end in sight to the rolling disclosures and news updates and potential legislation and stuff happening around the Typhoon APT. So we'll talk about what happened at the end of 2024 and what's continuing to happen and will continue to happen throughout 2025. We've got boot kits, beyond boot kitty, one bootloader to rule them all. We'll talk about network infrastructure attack surface, the firewalls, routers, and VPNs inside the environment that are a growing target for threats of every level of sophistication. We'll talk about firmware vulnerabilities, UEFI and BIOS vulnerabilities that keep on coming and are becoming more and more mainstream and commoditized and are dangerously undersecured against. And then finally, touching on the impact of AI and LLMs on cybersecurity and automation in general, how it's impacting both the defense and the attack landscape. So starting off, the year of the typhoon, state-sponsored APTs living off the land. Paul, what happened and what's coming next?
Yeah, I think the most recent news with Salt Typhoon is still unfolding as we speak. Of course, as you said, Chase, there's been a kind of a long history now of typhoons. I think Microsoft first labeled the first Volt Typhoon a few years ago, actually, and several more have cropped up. Essentially, they don't just target network devices and appliances, but that's certainly in scope. And they have very distinct targets, all tying back to Chinese-based threat actors. A couple of other campaigns are very similar to that. Sophos, of course, disclosed the Pacific Rim, and there was an Israeli incident response firm that labeled one Velvet Ant. All kind of similar tactics, techniques, and procedures that were happening, including, targeting VPN and firewall appliances, as well as implanting inside the infrastructure to steal accounts, steal intellectual property, and kind of just linger and hang out. In the most recent instantiation of that is Salt Typhoon, which targeted, as many of you know, the telecommunications infrastructure here in the US. There's several large telcos that were targeted with these attacks. We have a little bit of information. We did post on it last year in terms of some of the vulnerabilities that were included in there. There might be some indicators of compromise that have been disclosed, but the investigation's ongoing, and it's kind of a frustrating point for us as researchers. We want to know more about these attacks and exactly what unfolded against the telcos here in the US. We don't have that information yet. And that's kind of the quote that I put at the bottom, no official reports indicating how or if the attacks were successful or in what way, if malware is installed, if it was installed, what type of malware, what they were seeking, what was the purpose. We do know that some of the CALIA or wiretap data was accessed, I believe, is what was disclosed as part of this breach, but still kind of light on details. And this is an evolving incident that we're tracking very closely here at Eclypsium to see if we can develop defensive and detection measures for any of the activities associated with any of the Typhoon campaigns.
Yeah, so a lot of stuff happened right at the end of the year last year, and then what to expect from typhoons in 2025. I mean, immediately a lot of sort of executive action within the government resultant. And as you said, Paul, it's like details are kind of thin on the ground. There were 8 or maybe 9 now specific organizations named. Obviously, that's sensitive information, but I read in one of the many pieces of news coverage about this that there were hundreds of other potential organizations that had been maybe even compromised. And honestly, if you look at the types of devices that are potentially being targeted, there's really no ceiling on how many folks could be affected by this, or should at least do a little due diligence inside of their environment to assure that they're not at risk. But again, we need some technical details about what's actually happening to do that. So what do you see coming? How do you think this is going to play out over the next few months and the rest of the year?
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds from a regulatory standpoint. It's already driving some initiatives from the FCC in addition to the U.S. Treasury Department. As you kind of laid out there in the slide very nicely, Chase. Where sanctions are one way to deal with this kind of problem. I think it's kind of a debate as to how effective sanctions can be. Perhaps a debate for another time, but certainly there's a lot of us in the security community that we see sanctions come down as a reaction to cybersecurity related events, and doesn't really have an impact. I think is kind of an open-ended question. The interesting in kind of breaking news that just broke this week, as here in the U.S. we're undergoing an administration change, and one of the changes that has been a result of that is the Cyber Safety Review Board has been disbanded. So these were like it reads like a superhero list of cybersecurity folks, Chris Krebs, being one of them. And I remember the Chris Krebs name because Chris actually resigned from the CSRB before Trump took office. But the Trump administration, through a memorandum, has disbanded that Cyber Safety Review Board. That's significant to the typhoons because those were the people who were actively investigating as part of like a group effort this investigation. So it remains to be seen who is going to pick up the ball, and by who I mean, which agency is going to spearhead it and coordinate it, and what type of other people are going to be able to participate to work on this problem with the typhoons. So it remains to be seen, what's going to happen in 2025 in terms of typhoons. My hope is that we get this is my pipe dream, right, Chase and audience, that we get reasonable and effective regulation, which obviously doesn't always happen, but it does happen sometimes, right? And we get details from the investigation so that moving forward, we can be in a better position to defend against these threats. And that's my hope.
Yeah, 100%. You make a great point that there's a bunch of angles. There's the technical angle. How do you, release the details so that folks can secure themselves? The policy and regulation angle, and then just the sort of storm of information that's constantly swirling around that prompts people to urgently react, even in the absence of that information. It makes for a really complex situation. So interesting landscape, and I think we're still early in seeing how it's going to play out.
For sure.
We're keeping a close eye on it. Absolutely. We had a question from the audience. Will the deck or recording be shared? Yes, absolutely. We'll get that stuff to you out there. Thank you for asking. So great segue from the typhoons into network infrastructure attacks. This is the attack surface inside of every enterprise, every government agency. You have network stuff. You got firewalls, routers, and VPNs, and those have continued to be a massive target for threat actors of all levels of sophistication, from state-sponsored APTs to just sort of financially motivated ransomware gangs. And there was a lot of development in how those are targeted, disclosures of vulnerabilities in these types of devices in 2024. And based on how the first couple of weeks of January 2025 have gone, this is going to be a big thing in 2025. So we like to talk about how network infrastructure is treated differently than regular endpoints. There's this long history of securing endpoints, and there's a huge, range of technologies already being employed to secure endpoints. But when it comes to network devices like firewalls and routers and stuff, you kind of trust the vendor, right? And it's turning out that might not be the right answer.
Yeah, it's interesting, Chase. So I was talking yesterday with a CISO of a large financial institution, 100,000 employees, and I asked specifically about the network device and security appliance threat. And one of the things that I thought was different in this person's answer was relying more on threat intelligence to try and get ahead of the threats that are coming after these devices. So now it's well known, right? CISOs are going, this is definitely an attack surface that we have to defend. And we don't have great tools, other than patching and some monitoring, but we don't have great visibility into these devices. We don't have an EDR on these devices as a stopgap measure. So let's rely on threat intelligence and get ready to apply patches to parts of our infrastructure. And when he said he did that, it took them 8 hours. Like once the patch was available, they did that in 8 hours because they were prepping, relying on threat intelligence, going, there's threat actors, attacking this particular infrastructure appliance. He didn't name names, but they all have flaws that are being disclosed in addition to threat actors actively deploying malware. 27 minutes ago, my feed picked up an article that talks about it, so we didn't have time to put it in the slides, right? Juniper Enterprise routers are being backdoored via something they're calling a magic packet or JMagic backdoor. So that like literally just broke 26 minutes ago, speaking to the trend that we're seeing and going to continue to see in 2025.
Yeah, 100%. And you did a little bit of slicing and dicing of the CISA known exploited vulnerabilities and top routinely exploited vulnerabilities lists this year, and found essentially that the vendors and the technologies that are most represented in the top routinely, not just the known exploited vulnerabilities, but the top ones. CISA released this data in 2024. The data I think was from 2023. But yeah, Citrix, Cisco, Fortinet, hugely represented in the known exploited vulnerabilities. So this is it's a growing concern, and I'm glad to hear that in the conversations that you're having, the awareness and sort of the preparation to deal with it is happening. And we've got this timeline, looking back and all the way to 2005. You've got a few things happening. As you get towards 2024, the list of this type of compromise that specifically targeted network devices has just got almost too big for us to fit in this one slide anymore.
Right.
And then as we look towards 2025, well, already, we're not even a month in, and there's a lot happening. What have you seen so far in 2025, and what do you expect to see going forward based on these disclosures, like that Juniper one that you just mentioned, and these other ones that happened a little sooner?
Yeah, the attackers are still targeting these devices. They still have vulnerabilities that are exploitable, that researchers are publishing information about, details about these vulnerabilities. Public proof of concept exploits exist for them. And in just this year, I think it was the Avanti one. The Avanti one was very interesting. I might be jumping the gun for another slide, but I'll talk about it here, right? We talked about the Avanti one, Chase, in prep for this, and it was astonishing to me for a couple of reasons, right? Like, yes, we all make hardware, software, firmware, and yes, none of it's perfect, and we can find vulnerabilities and or flaws or exposures in all of it. But I think there's a maturity curve when we look at specifically the samples of the types of vulnerabilities we're seeing, not to pick on Avanti, but it was the most recent one. There's a remote stack-based buffer overflow right? That we can trace back to Smashing the Stack for Fun and Profit, which sometime in the 90s, right, when we first, and memory corruption vulnerabilities date back much further than that as well. And it was very much to me when I analyzed them, like, well, this is like a basic stack-based buffer overflow. That's kind of interesting in their web server that is the back end to their web management interface. And the recent newsletter that I read, earlier this week was like, well, there's this proof of concept exploit, but it's not fully functioning. But no fear. Go to this other GitHub page, and there's a full functioning exploit for it. So these are vulnerabilities in software that if you have an SDLC or secure development process of any kind, in my opinion, and I covered this space in depth when I used to host other podcasts on the network, but these are vulnerabilities that should come out in QA and security testing before the product ships, in my opinion. And it's not just the one from Avanti, several others. So I think there's, where the vendors that are producing these network and security appliances are behind the curve in implementing security controls and security practices that could, in the future, result in more reliable and safer products for us to use. It pains me when the advice is, well, just don't expose your web management interfaces to the internet. So you mean tell me that a device that literally has to sit on the edge of the network facing the internet shouldn't have its web management interface exposed to the internet because it's too insecure, right? It's too much risk. I think these devices need to be more reliable. It remains to be seen, how that will develop over the course of this year. But I think we're going to see a good number of more vulnerabilities in these appliances because there's so many and there's so much code that already exists.
Yeah, 100%. And something that's really challenging about the way that these kinds of threats compound is represented. We've got this screenshot from this story from Kevin Beaumont about the 2022 zero day that got used to raid FortiGate firewall configs. And then those configs just got released. So, okay, this is a vulnerability from a couple of years ago, probably patched in a lot of environments, but information that was stolen, including really sensitive, internal usernames and credentials, and firewall configurations, firewall rules for folks using FortiGate firewalls, that information has now been dumped and is creating, another whole response cycle for any organization that had those at the time. So it's not like these come out and maybe you get compromised at the time or not, and then you patch it and you feel good. It's like the potential impact later on is always still there, and then you're dealing with whatever's happening at the moment, and also what happened a couple of years ago that you thought you had under control, and now it's not anymore. So the ongoing impact of these really compounds and multiplies in a way that needs to be addressed at the root, at the foundation inside of these devices. And segueing from that into a new one, we just published a new blog post today, co-authored by Paul and some researchers here at Eclypsium. Paul, what's going on with Palo Alto firewalls right now?
Yeah, so it's interesting. They had vulnerabilities kind of like under the covers inside Palo Alto firewalls. And just to kind of back up, Palo Alto in previous communications on their website and to customers recognized some of these vulnerabilities and essentially said, and it's covered in detail in the blog post, but that we released this morning, essentially said, like, we're not going to fix them. An attacker would need root level access to the device in order to be able to attempt to exploit this vulnerability. And they said, so we're not going to fix it. When our research team looked inside of the Palo Alto firewalls, we found that, well, first of all, there exist public exploits that allow a remote attacker, if the firewall is vulnerable, to become a root level user on that system. Once they have root level access to that system, the vulnerabilities that we uncovered allow the attacker to implant themselves pre-operating system into the device. Similar to the Sophos Pacific Rim right? They also kind of fall in this category where we saw attackers actually researching some of this pre-operating system capabilities. This gives the attackers the stealth, persistence, and impact that they're driving after. So techniques that we describe, and there's a demo video with an exploit, are used by attackers to be able to persist in the device across reboots, across firmware upgrades, across full system restores in certain circumstances. So the big one from this one was the existence of the boot hole vulnerability. So the bootloader used in the underlying Linux-based operating system on Palo Alto firewalls is vulnerable, which allows attackers to bypass secure boot, right? That was like 2020 research, ironically from Mickey and Jesse, who did the research on the Palo Alto firewalls. So they were able to put an exploit chain together to exploit the bootloader. We also found that the UEFI BIOS code contain known vulnerabilities. Some of those date back as far as 2021. Inside of there, some of those also are ones that received a name, right, and a lot of attention, like Pixie Fail and Logo Fail. And the big takeaway for me in terms of the challenge that we have is we are getting network devices and security appliances that do not have the industry standard, widely accepted, well-known security controls either in place, properly configured, and free of vulnerabilities. So we've known about these vulnerabilities for a long time. We've known about security protections that should exist in this level of the platform security. And what we're finding when we look inside these devices is those controls are not in place. And, if they are, there are vulnerabilities that allow attackers to circumvent those controls. So that's not just picking on Palo Alto. That's, an industry-wide problem. The advice that I have for folks to deal with this, right, which is kind of the next logical question, is patch these devices very often, get really good at patching them. And I know it's hard, especially when it's a VPN appliance. It could mean some operational downtime. Don't expose the management interfaces to the internet, and internally tightly control access to those management interfaces, not just the web management interface, but SNMP or SSH or any other management interface on them. Make sure that's tightly controlled. And monitor your logs in addition to your network traffic that are going to these devices directly, not just the traffic passing through, right, but traffic going to and from the device itself is the best advice that I have. Because again, they're not just in the crosshairs of threat actors, there's also many vulnerabilities that are being discovered, disclosed, and then ultimately patched by the vendor. And that is the one kind of saving grace is a lot of the vendors are aggressively releasing patches. So in the Palo Alto case, make sure that the remote access to your Palo Alto devices is really locked down and secured, because if an attacker were to gain a foothold, they could bury themselves deeper.
100% well said. And I think a lot of the advice that you just noted is echoed or documented well in this CISA guidance for hardening communications infrastructure, which came out in the wake of the Salt Typhoon disclosures, where it became apparent that there's a huge need for cyber hardening in telcos in particular. And everything that you just said, monitoring, inventory, patching. There was even specific guidance around Cisco because those were thought to be heavily targeted devices.
Right.
And Eclipsium is able to detect some of these vulnerabilities in these specifically targeted Cisco devices. So yeah, it's hard. I mean, patching at the rate that you need to keep up with these things and doing the monitoring and having the inventory, these are not necessarily already muscle memory inside the targeted organizations. Having a inventory of your firmware and knowing whether it's vulnerable. Yeah, you mentioned a maturity curve, and that might be pretty high on the maturity curve. But as the attacks get more commoditized and available and widely used against firmware and against these types of devices, the security practices to protect those are going to have to get more widespread as well.
Yeah, and I think those that are managing and maintaining these appliances are familiar with this, but I think it deserves a call out because it's called out here in monitoring for end of life announcements. And those of the this is in their day job may know some of the challenges in trying to figure out what that means because it's more just end of life is kind of like a high level blanket term. And what we discovered, and this came about when we looked at the Palo Alto devices, and it reminded me that, there's end of sale, there's end of support, there's end of life, and that applies to both the hardware and the software. So you have to really do some digging to go, how long am I going to keep this device before I don't get patches for it anymore. And then backtrack from there and create a plan to go, okay, I need to replace this device, once I can apply the latest patches. And when that is, requires some research and digging to go like, when is, in Palo Alto's case, right? It's the one I looked at, like what version of the software do they support? What's the end of when they're going to stop producing patches for that is really that's when the clock ends, the for that device. So pay
Yeah.
attention to that. And, that requires then like part of security that is very much a process. That's a budgeting process, right? An approval process, giving your management a heads up like, hey, in 2027, we are going to have to replace these firewalls. They may work perfectly fine, which is frustrating, I know, but we won't receive patches from the vendor anymore. And especially with these devices that could be a very risky proposition if you've got legacy devices that you're not getting patches for.
Paul, I'm sorry, I blacked out a little bit when you said budgeting process for 2027,
Yeah,
but it seems like you
right.
nailed it. So let's keep going. Yeah. What you said too, the schedule, the end of life schedule, it can be different across the software and the hardware and the firmware,
Yeah.
and keeping all of those in line for a single device or platform, really challenging. And ultimately, this is just sort of a summary of what you've been saying,
Right.
but you know, things that deserve repetition deserve to be posted up on the wall because it's not a solved problem yet, and it's something that we in the security industry, as well as the regulators, as well as the enterprises and users, really have to collaborate on.
Right. I wanted to talk about the last bullet because I haven't covered that yet. And this is a frustrating point, I think, for both security researchers as well as customers, is that lack of visibility and access to the underpinnings of these devices. Right. Sophos deployed like a kernel level agent to gain visibility into attacker behaviors. We as researchers, you as customers, aren't afforded that luxury to be able to have that level of visibility into these systems, which is greatly concerning for me. Also, so to me, this walled garden approach isn't working. Also, under the covers, we should have put air quotes commodity hardware and firmware. Some of these are customized, so they're not necessarily what we would deem strictly as commodity. But often these appliances that we get are Intel-based PCs or AMD-based PCs or ARM-based PCs under the covers running operating systems such as Linux. Now, that's not always the case, right? And there are some better countermeasures such as drive encryption that are implemented that makes an attacker's life a little miserable, quite frankly, which is good. But as a general statement, what we're finding, not just us, but others as well, amongst all of these appliances, is that underneath is an Intel, usually Intel-based PC running Linux. Uh, but going back to our, slide where we compare that to Windows systems, we don't treat it the same way. We don't have the level of visibility. We don't have EDR. We don't have great tools and techniques to give us that deep level of visibility to detect the indicators of compromise, to detect the malware. It's something we work on every day here at Eclypsium in research and engineering, providing our customers as many ways as we can to gain that visibility. And we've done that for a number of platforms, but it continues to be a challenge because they like to look at this as, I'll call it the walled garden approach, right? Like, don't look under the covers, just use the software that's on top of it and what's underneath there, what we're finding can be troublesome in terms of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, well said. I think in 2025, what we're going to see is a lot more demand and accountability for that kind of
Yeah.
visibility and control. So, ongoing theme here, all of these sort of 2025 themes tie together a lot because firmware threats, bootkits, Bootkitty, the Linux bootkit that came out in 2024, highly relevant to when there's just a Linux under the covers on these critical network infrastructure inside the covers. So as we see increased research and increased availability of firmware targeting exploits, that is going to dovetail and amplify with the continued targeting of network devices, network critical infrastructure, and it's all really gonna balloon quickly into an issue that can't be ignored. Not that it is being ignored, but something that is going to require some really concrete action steps. Paul, can you recap Bootkitty, and then let's talk about sort of what's coming. You used the phrase recently that I loved: "One bootloader to rule them all." And I want to talk about what that's going to mean for people in 2025.
It's all very similar, right? We talk about bootloader, we talk about one bootloader to rule them all, and Bootkitty, as well as some. I think we've got information on some new vulnerabilities in bootloaders that were disclosed by ESET, and they're all in this class of vulnerabilities that are essentially attacking the bootloader, right? So at a high level, when your computer boots up, your UEFI BIOS does its thing. And before the operating system loads, many familiar with this concept of a bootloader. Typically, it should be like under the covers. It shouldn't be something you have to really worry about. But there is program running called the bootloader that sits between your UEFI BIOS and your operating system to help the operating system load. Where attackers are going after the bootloader is really for like two reasons. One, if the bootloader contains vulnerabilities that you can exploit, you can do things like commonly it's used to bypass secure boot, right? Since you can't modify the bootloader, because if you did, secure boot would say, I can't boot your system. However, if there's a vulnerability in an existing bootloader that is approved by secure boot, and attackers will exploit that vulnerability, gain control of the system at that point in the boot process, and also be able to bypass secure boot. We've seen a little more research on bootloaders in it. Bootkitty is an example. Researchers out of a university in South Korea, I believe it was, did some research on what if we were to put bad things in a bootloader. The other thing that luxury it affords the attackers is it's before the operating system and specifically the kernel loads. So the bootloader, I can tell the operating system to turn things off, to load malware in places where it's not going to find it. And there's lots of techniques in basically tricking the operating system because it's before all the operating system and other protections are loaded. It's a great point for attackers to inject malware in bad things and have a much easier time hiding on the system and evading other defensive measures that rely on the operating system and the operating system kernel. So we've seen Bootkitty, we've seen some more vulnerabilities in bootloaders that were approved by Secure Boot, cryptographically signed to work with Secure Boot. Those had vulnerabilities. One bootloader to rule them all was also bootloaders that had vulnerabilities. Boothole was vulnerabilities in Grub that allowed you to bypass Secure Boot. And so we're seeing this kind of continuation on a theme. Black Lotus was another great example of manipulating bootloaders and vulnerabilities to gain code execution before the operating system.
Yeah. So when we talk about, this being a real world thing, the Pacific Rim, really great example of firmware being specifically backdoored and, either evasion or disabling secure boot, sort of this kind of attack technique being used in the wild. It's not hypothetical, and it would be easy to say, okay, the Pacific Rim threat actor was very sophisticated, but no, in my opinion, and keep me honest, Paul, but no attack technique that gets used successfully is going to stay the purview of only sophisticated actors over time. When something works, it's going to get developed and eventually become available to less sophisticated adversaries
Yeah.
and used against less sophisticated targets. And so there's no, there's no security or protection in feeling like, oh, I'm not going to get targeted by this thing because it's a very sophisticated technique, because it's going to become, commodity available.
Yeah, in Pacific Rim, we saw attackers going after UEFI. So this is even before the bootloader loads at an even deeper level in the operating system, where you can even more easily disable secure boot if you wanted to with access to UEFI. And it's interesting to speak to who uses exploits that are targeting UEFI. It's not just nation state threat actors, it's also the gaming community are using exploits in UEFI to get around game cheat, anti-cheat protections inside of games. And they try and load the anti-cheat protections as early in the operating system as possible. So game cheaters are like, oh, I'll just exploit UEFI, and then I have control before those things kick in. So it's certainly, as Chase, you said, a technique that's being used. We saw test systems in the case of Pacific Rim by attackers exploring exploitation in UEFI to do things such as bypass security controls like Intel Boot Guard, which is a security mechanism which tries to prevent any modifications to UEFI in it even before secure boot kicks in on the system. So there are some known exploits for boot guard, but also boot guard has to be enabled on the system. So we saw attackers kind of playing in that space, which is interesting. Well, also, the other takeaway from Pacific Rim was the firmware infection and reinfection. They didn't necessarily come up with a new and novel technique, but they used a couple of known techniques strung together such that if you upgraded the firmware on your Sophos firewall, in this case, it would reinfect the system. And had a very novel way of doing that and hooking, the firmware in certain ways so that when the update process was kicked off, it called the attacker code to go and reinfect the firmware. So that was certainly eye-opening for me in terms of things we might see moving forward. We saw in the case of Pacific Rim a very novel way, in my opinion, of firmware reinfection being tested by attackers.
I love that gamers are such early adopters. It's like
Right?
some people want to compromise government agencies and telcos, and some people just want an aimbot to get those sweet headshots.
Right?
But yeah, and so another sort of example, another point in the firmware threats topic is another piece of research that Eclypsium released just this year based on some research that was done late 2024 about a DNA sequencer device with a vulnerable BIOS and vulnerable firmware. And it sort of speaks to the widespread nature of this, that firmware is in everything, right? And a lot of it's the same. And so it's sort of, if you think of like the headwaters of a big river, all the water goes downstream. If you pour poison in the headwaters, it goes everywhere that river goes. Firmware is so foundational to every piece of computing technology, everything that's connected to a network. And so as you see those sort of foundational components being targeted, all kinds of devices are potentially a target for that. In this case, this vulnerable DNA sequencer, it's being used for important medical research, and so if that gets compromised, the downstream impact of that could be devastating. Yeah, I don't know. Any further thoughts on the DNA sequencer? I want to be mindful of time, but just
Yeah, it's yet another example of PC-based architecture making its way into an appliance, or in this case, a device that's used in the medical research community. And somewhere in the supply chain, there is not checks and balances to make sure that the platform security, right, the UEFI BIOS and other things have the proper security controls. So it's kind of another example of that outside of network and security appliances.
Yeah, 100%. So we already kind of talked about one bootloader to rule them all, UEFI secure boot vulnerabilities. This is just an ongoing drumbeat. It's an area of increasing research. Paul, I know that you are seeing everything that comes out about this. And in general, we've kind of been talking about this. If you have any further ones to talk about this specific instance, or we can jump forward to our sort of overall summary of the firmware risk that exists out there.
Yeah, I think it's important to this is, one bootloader to rule them all was 2023, I think, research from Mickey and Jesse, our researchers. The new ones to come out were from ESET, and they were very similar in that bootloaders that are assigned to work with secure boot have vulnerabilities that could be exploited by attackers. We didn't talk about the defense against this. It's really very quickly twofold. One, make sure you update and monitor your bootloaders. They shouldn't change that often, right? So monitoring for changes there is a good thing to do, and also making sure your UEFI certificates and specifically revocation list is up to date. We've talked at length about that. A lot of resources on our blog and website on how to do that. So that's the advice there.
Yeah, 100%. And just to kind of tie it all together, it's firmware is not only in the BIOS, right? It's everywhere. And as you were talking about, I look at this visual and I think about the different schedules for end of life and the different levels of expertise or the different tooling that you would need to be able to address a vulnerability in any of these, and just the complexity of the supply chain where different ones of these components come from different places, different manufacturers, different software and firmware, and the challenge in maintaining an inventory of that. Asset inventory is it's the first thing on the list. It's a foundational cybersecurity practice. And sometimes when you think asset inventory, you might not be thinking at this Zoom level. You might not look at this and think, oh, each of these things is something that I got to have tracked in an inventory, and I got to be monitoring for change over time, and I got to be validating integrity. But that's how it is.
And there are some attack paths here. I want to call out two very quickly. We talk about network cards. It's on the slide as number 3 right there. Network cards run firmware. There's a facility where at boot time, a network card can pass a driver into UEFI, and there was some Black Hat research this year that looked at exploitation paths with that. It's something we've also looked at in the past at Eclypsium and keep tabs on. So now you have to worry about what network card do I have? What firmware do I have? Is it vulnerable? Is it configured properly? Because it's a potential attack path that has not been very widely publicized. Also, BMCs or baseboard management controllers. You've seen quite a bit of research from Eclypsium looking at flaws in the BMC chips that are typically ARM-based running Linux. That is like a computer within your computer that runs and has the highest level of access to your system. Even before UEFI, if an attacker were to gain access to the baseboard management controller, it would be like an air quotes bad day. Super hard to not just detect, but kick them out of that system because they have such a high level of access.
Yeah, it's like as any particular asset in the environment becomes more secured, we talked about the endpoints having all these security tools pointed at them. Attackers are going to look for other ways that are less secured. So this is a growing area for that for sure, because it's not as well secured as some of the other attack surfaces. So yeah, we say firmware is the largest blind spot, and here's just some examples of vulnerabilities or attack techniques or CVEs in all of those different components that we had covered in the previous slide. So I think throughout 2025 and beyond, we're going to see more research into this, probably more disclosures of attacks that explicitly targeted firmware or used it particularly as a persistence mechanism, a place to hide out and ride out an incident response. Even for a security incident that gets detected and gets responded and you work to eradicate the threat, not everybody's going to have the ability to eradicate a threat that knows how to hide out in the firmware and then reinstall malware afterwards, as you described with the Pacific Rim campaign. So our next and final theme that we're getting into is AI, LLMs, and automation, changing the face of cyber defense and attacks. Obviously, for several years now, this has been a very hyped, very frankly noisy area of discussion is like, how is AI going to affect cybersecurity, and the potential of the use of AI to develop exploit code really quickly for new vulnerabilities is one area I've seen discussed a lot. Generally, LLMs being used as a sort of assistant for programming and for all types of research. It's pretty undeniable that this technology is already massively affecting cybersecurity and is going to continue. But I think there's a couple of somewhat under-discussed areas of how it is. There's a lot of faces to this, and I feel like I see a lot of like, okay, there's gonna be AI powered attacks, fine, and then there's gonna be AI powered defense. Like, yeah, it's going to influence all technology, but I feel like it's opening up sort of new attack surfaces and new opportunities for really novel approaches both to attacking and defending. And one something I read recently that was really interesting and that I thought was worth highlighting is this Microsoft post on red teaming Gen AI. So when everybody's using Gen AI for some aspect of their business, and as AI becomes more and more foundational to lines of business inside of the enterprise, it becomes more important to make sure that the Gen AIs aren't vulnerable to attack or to prompt injection or whatever. And the quote that I liked from this article was that AI models have expanded the cyber attack surface by introducing new vulnerabilities, exploiting the fact that AI models often struggle to distinguish between system-level instructions and user data. And that notion that there's this sort of black box system that is the Gen AI that's going to have a hard time telling what's user data, it's like fuzzing input sanitization has always been a challenge in various cybersecurity contexts. And when the thing you're giving input to is a generative AI product that might have pretty deep hooks into an important part of your enterprise stack, then that input sanitization gets really important. And the difficulty of sussing out what's going to happen with your input, it's really difficult to know what is considered sanitary input or where the risks are. So tons of research happening. And the three basic takeaways from this Microsoft research were that AI amplifies existing risks and introduces new ones, which is what that quote's about, and that human expertise is fundamental to improving AI security. I think that they didn't find that, at least with the products that they red teamed, they found that sort of having humans in the loop to identify and work on how to make sure that the AI is using the data in a way that's secure, and that the data itself is being secure, and that the outputs of the actions that it takes aren't negatively impacting your security posture. Humans are still a critical part of that process. And then that defense is in depth is key for keeping AI safe. And that was along the lines of what Paul was saying earlier, that there's a technical element to it, but there's also a regulatory element to it as well. There's various technical and policy sort of aspects to make sure that the rapid ingestion of AI into enterprises and the rapid sort of inclusion of AI in business critical processes is not introducing new vulnerabilities or new security problems that we don't even know about. I'm curious, Paul, what's your take on Gen AI in cybersecurity?
I think it's very similar to when it reminds me of when we were all encouraged to move to the cloud and cloud technologies came on the scene. And while they're two very different technologies, right? I think the challenges that we have in the progression of how we do cybersecurity in these various environments is kind of similar, right? So we didn't understand, like, what are these new attack paths that the cloud will bring? What are the new risks? How do we secure it? How do we monitor it? And eventually we figured it out, right? I think we're in like early days of cloud when it comes to Gen AI, in that we've got this new thing and we don't quite understand the attack paths. We don't quite understand like what's a vulnerability, how do we secure it, kind of thing. And I think we'll get there, right? And so that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree. And we're obviously not the only ones paying attention to this, but in 2024, NIST put out this adversarial machine learning taxonomy and terminology of attacks and mitigations. So, and in the same, moving forward pretty quickly here, last year, the Linux Foundation put out this concept of an AI bill of materials using SPDX, classic SBOM format modified to focus more on what goes into the AI thing. So when we talk about a technical versus policy versus the various angles that you have to take to secure this, the big some major organizations are working on ways to do this, and it's obviously going to get way more important as AI, the development and the advancement in AI products is escalating super rapidly. And as far as what's going to happen in 2025, I mean, the Gen AI research from Microsoft, the NIST adversarial machine learning thing, this AI bill of materials, all from sort of late 2024. And then just earlier this month, there was this Stargate project that got announced. So a $500 billion AI infrastructure project to build AI data centers in the US. You've got, Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, at the White House. There is a huge amount of development going to be happening, and the infrastructure for AI itself is likely to become a target. When we talk about network devices, when we talk about the sort of foundations of technology being targeted, well, when giant, multi-billion-dollar AI focused data centers start coming online, and the compute resources that those are providing are foundational to a sort of new wave of businesses, that infrastructure is going to come under attack the same way that network infrastructure is under attack right now. And figuring out how to secure that stuff is going to be a challenge that I think comes up quickly. I don't know. Paul, what do you think? AI infrastructure wise, I think it's going to be a huge thing in 2025 and beyond, but I'm curious what your thoughts are about this topic.
Yeah, I think it's important for, the US to invest heavily in this technology, continue to learn and improve these various technologies in AI. I also think it's important that governments and big companies don't control the AI, that we also have open source models such as Llama, so that we can do things on our own and train our own models for our own purpose without any of the bias, intentional or not, that could be included in some of the Gen AI.
Yeah, absolutely. Been reading a lot about the recently released DeepSeek model. That's people are spinning it up on like a Mac Mini on their desk, and the idea of a local AGI. AGI gets bandied about a lot. I don't know if anyone can really even state a definition that they mean by it, but the acceleration of development in this area is enormous. And just to give a quick plug for what Eclypsium is doing here, we've got our Automata product that is an AI-driven analytics service for the analysis of code. And if you can give a quick pitch for what we're doing with this analysis product, and then we'll bring it home.
Yeah, I mean, at a high level, right? Automata's tearing things apart and trying to emulate what a security researcher would do to uncover any vulnerabilities or malicious behavior indicators of compromise inside of firmware. And slightly more technical level, right, where I hate to use the word automating because but we do automate, right, the disassembly, decompilation of binaries inside of firmware, analyze that for known vulnerabilities. If we break it down into source code, we have tools running against the source code to discover vulnerabilities. We also have some kind of anomaly detection to say, is this firmware been backdoored? Is there malware in this firmware? And we're putting that all in an analytics kind of engine that does that on an automated basis, and even incorporating things like Gen AI to help us uncover vulnerabilities in it. So it's already, since we stood it up, found several vulnerabilities in UEFI firmware, and we're working on expanding that support as we speak. So it's certainly very exciting.
Yeah, in our corner of the world, the major problem that we discussed, the firmware security, using AI to automate and accelerate the investigation and discovery of those vulnerabilities, trying to make a difference for these organizations that are definitely vulnerable to this type of attack. So, all right, so a lot of this material that we talked about is subject matter that's also covered in our 2024 year in review below the surface threat report. So, the stuff that happened in 2024 and the momentum that was built around these topics is a strong indicator that these are trends to watch in 2025. And if you want deeper dives and links to resources about every single one of these topics, this is a beefy report that we put together. Lots of more stories, more examples in each of these categories of network device targeting and firmware threats and automation and supply chain security, as well as resources, links to big repositories of AI tools that you can use right now for security, and research that Microsoft and OpenAI and others are doing about red teaming AI products, and the overall landscape of how to use AI securely for your business, and also to use it for security of other parts of your business, which is something that we at Eclypsium are also trying to do as well. So you can visit eclypsium.com/threat report to get that report. We'll also send out a link to it in a follow-up email. We have had a few people in the audience ask whether the slides and recording will be shared, and they absolutely will. If you attended, we will send you a link to the recording and to the slides, as well as to some of these adjacent resources that we've shared. And just want to say thank you so much. And if we've got, I think, 4 minutes left in the hour, and I would love it if anybody wants to pop a question in the Q&A, and we'll take some live until we run out of time. The main question so far has been about whether we're going to share the recording, which we absolutely will. And we've got someone who just said, "This has been a really great webinar. Definitely got Eclypsium and Automata on my radar to look into. Thank you." Thank you. Really appreciate your saying that. And it's been a delight to present with you. I'm Chase Snyder, and this is Paul Asadoorian, who requires no introduction. And looking forward to talking with you on the next webinar. And if you'd like to reach out with any further questions or comments afterwards, feel free. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Chase. Thanks, Melissa.
Thanks, everyone. And again, we will be sending out the links. You'll see an email from me, Melissa Russell. I'll get that out tomorrow. And again, thank you again for joining us. I did want to let you know that probably our next webinar will be towards the end of February. We're going to be talking about firmware vulnerabilities. So looking forward to seeing you on the next one. And thanks again, Chase and Paul.
Thank you.